Three, two, one.
We'd like to welcome you to another edition of Grok Talk, brought to you by New Hampshire's leading conservative blog site, GraniteGrok.com. We are your feared, extremist, right-wing, hard-charging, gun-toting, opinionated, outspoken, rabble-rousing, letter-writing, radio microphone stomping conservatives and rational libertarians. So get ready for more news and opinion you could only get from GraniteGrok.com.
Grok Talk.
We are your fire-breathing, hard-charging, gun-toting, outspoken, rabble-rousing, freedom-loving conservatives and libertarians. Thanks to Mike Ferris for joining us on the show. A lot of great pull quotes in that interview. I can't wait to get into it and listen to it again. Again, Dan Hines came in to talk to us about religious liberty earlier in the program, and of course Max Abramson joined us. It's always great to have Max here. He has tons to contribute. And we're going to move forward now. Our next guest is Lawrence McQuillan. He is a senior fellow and director of the Center of Entrepreneurial Innovation at the Independent Institute. Received his PhD in economics from George Mason University. Served as chief economist at the Illinois Policy Institute, director of business and economic studies at the Pacific Research Institute. He's written a book called California Dreaming: Lessons in How to Resolve America's Public Pension Crisis. Welcome to the show, sir.
Hey, good morning. Great to be with you.
Great to have you on. So, this is a great topic. We've had a couple of different folks on to talk about this. I can't remember who was on last. We were talking about pensions like 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it's a huge problem. I think in Illinois we were talking about.
Wasn't it one of the AFP folks?
It was somebody from AFP, yes, yeah. And I can't remember who it was. But you've written this great book, and so I mean, I obviously it needed to be written. Why did you decide to do it?
Well, it's kind of a national financial crisis that's facing, almost every state has an unfunded public pension debt. And, being an economist, I like anything financial, and it's a rising issue across the country, and particularly in California, where I live and where the Institute is. Right now we have a $750 billion, that's with a B, $750 billion unfunded public pension debt just for California alone. Nationwide, it's $4.7 trillion. So, I mean, it's a huge crisis, and I think, not a lot of people are aware of the extent of it and what kind of impact it's having on local governments, local communities. So I think it's an ideal topic for a book, and this book is kind of a primer. If you don't know a whole lot about it, you can pick it up and read it rather quickly, and it'll kind of give you everything you need to know to get caught up on the issue.
So let's. How did this start? I mean, I know, but maybe our listeners aren't familiar. This has been going on obviously for decades, and we've reached a tipping point. Clearly, you haven't in California. We certainly have a similar problem in New Hampshire, where we have is it a $2 or $4 billion? It's anywhere
from 4 to 14 billion.
I got to find what headset you're on. Sorry, Max. Go ahead.
It's somewhere between 4 and 14 billion, depending on who you talk to.
Right. So, how did this begin?
Well, actually, the story is quite similar across states. I mean, what happened is for decades, politicians increased pension benefits primarily to buy votes and campaign contributions. They knew people would vote for them if they increased the pension benefits, and at the same time, though, they lowballed the contributions year after year. They weren't putting enough money into the pension fund so that ultimately there would be enough money in the pot 20, 30, 40 years down the road when people started retiring. And it was an easy process to do for politicians because they knew the bill would come due, 20, 30, 40 years out. They'd probably be long gone out of office, which is generally the case. It's certainly the case in California. And yet they could promise the moon today, knowing that they'd be long gone when the costs were due. So it's it's the perfect recipe for just political manipulation, and that's exactly what happened. Legislators just faced perverse incentives to mismanage these funds, and that's the way it was across the country. And of course, if they lowballed the contributions, it freed up money they could use for other programs, and they could buy votes and campaign contributions with that money, using it for other ways. And so they played this game for decades, and now the bill dollars come due, and taxpayers are now on the hook to make up the difference because the money's just not there.
Now, this is Skip Murphy. Thanks for coming on the show. Certainly, I've been watching this in Illinois and especially in California. I've just been waiting with dread about a federal bailout. Yeah, federal bailout from a federal government that owes over $18 trillion now with unfunded, in the hundreds of trillions. But you look at the cities and the towns in California especially, and Chicago right now, whose unfunded pension liabilities have basically said we can pay the pensions, which that's what the court seemed to be telling them to do, and now there are no services in a lot of these towns and cities. We see the same thing happening in Rhode Island. And how long do you think this is going to come to fruition as to the point of we just can't pay and we're going to take people's homes because they don't pay enough in taxes to be able to sell them off, to be able to pay these liabilities? I mean, this whole thing is a mess, but for the individual citizen living in cities where this mayhem that you just described happens, what's going to be the end point?
Well, the end point, it's already been reached in some parts of, especially in California, where we've seen 3 cities already go bankrupt largely over unaffordable pension costs. Vallejo was first, and then Stockton, California, and then more recently San Bernardino. So I think people out here in California especially are very aware of what can happen, what has happened, and keep in mind, like you said, well before bankruptcy, well before insolvency, what happens is that politicians divert money out of other accounts into the pension fund to try to make it work. And so that's what they've been doing out here in California, taking money out of police and fire, schools, libraries, roads, poor government services that, especially in a blue state like California, people like and they expect to be there. Right? When you pick up the phone and dial 911, you want the police to show up. But they've been taking money out of that. We've seen a huge depletion of the police force in Oakland and San Jose, largely because that money has been going to pay for very generous pension benefits. Oakland, for example, they cut their police force by 80 police because they needed the money for the pensions, and a few days later they announced they would no longer respond to 44 different crimes. So I think, when you reach that point where you're sacrificing public safety for pension costs, I think that's the tipping point. And out here, I think people get it. A recent survey of likely voters showed that 85% of likely voters in California see pension costs as either a problem or a big problem. So I think voters out here are way ahead of the legislators because they've lived this. They've seen the schools crumble and the police not show up and fire services cut, fire stations closed in Stockton, for example. So I think the public gets it. It's just a matter of getting a significant reform measure before the public, and I think they would vote for it.
Yeah, I think so. The people voted with their feet in Detroit because it became untenable as a place to live, and they first of all derided white flight, leaving the blacks to suffer. In fact, anybody who could afford to get out did, including any black families who had managed to make it up the ladder before the rungs were cut off. Leaving the city in complete disarray and decay, and Chicago's going the same way. But what I was going to say about your comment on the pensions and the cutting of the Oakland police, any betting that those living on the pensions that are being paid are not living within the city limits where they would be subject to that reduced protection? In other words, they're living somewhere out in the suburbs, up the slopes of Mount Diablo or something, and nowhere near the danger that their pensions are exposing the others to.
Yeah, you're right. And a lot of the pensioners are outside the state of California. In fact, there was recently a map that shows where all the CalPERS, which is the California Public Employees Retirement System, the biggest public pension program in the United States. And it showed a map, and so many of the retirees have left California, and the money just leaves the state then, of course, too. And you mentioned Detroit. That's a classic example of what can go wrong. not only don't you have enough money for paying pensions, but you end up not having enough money to even keep the street lights on. And
Exactly.
that's exactly what happened. And then ultimately, what they did in bankruptcy is they reduced pension benefits for current retirees. So they actually ended up cutting checks for pensions for current retirees in Detroit. And I think, that's exactly why I think either current public employees that are retired or soon to be retired should support the reforms that I talk about in my book, because it would guarantee that at least they would get paid for what they've earned. And we wouldn't have to go this route that they did in Detroit, which is actually reducing pension checks for retired people who are counting on that money being there.
Lawrence, this is Skip again. Now, a couple moments ago, you mentioned one of my not my infamous, but one of those phrases I really hate to have to bring up, but the blue social model, which you've aptly described, in a sort of a roundabout way. And I think it would be good for our listeners if you actually described what that model is, although we have lots of examples because that's what we're talking about. But do you think those, along with the description, do you think those cities and states are going to recognize the error of their ways and go back to, do the opposite of what they've been doing, or are they going to continue to act like Greece?
Well, I mean, in some cases they won't have any alternative because, at the local government level, you face some pretty tight constraints. So you can't get away with the shenanigans that they can at the state and certainly the federal government level. But yeah, I mean, what we're seeing is a very small group of people, public employees in states. In California, only 11% of the population is eligible for a public employee pension. So it's a very small percentage of the population is causing this huge impact on budgets at the state and local level in California, and they're devouring an ever greater percentage of the budget. For example, the bottom line is that pension costs are increasing 4 times the rate of tax revenue in California at the local government level. So just do the math, and anything that's increasing 4 times the base is eventually going to devour the base, and that's what we're seeing. Larger and larger percentage of the budgets are going to pensions, leaving less and less for other services. And in a blue state, people like their government services, especially the core essential ones, and that's unfortunately where most of the cuts have been happening in police and fire, because that's where the bigger salaries are and where the biggest pension benefits tend to be as well. So yeah, we've seen this situation grow over time where excessive benefit increases for pensions have ultimately led now to fewer and fewer government services, and this certainly gets the attention of Democrats and people who typically would be favorable towards government are seeing now this particular sector of government as being a huge burden and a huge drag on what they kind of see as the quality of life that they'd like to have for their states or local communities going forward. And the primary funding for my book came from San Francisco Democrats. So, people get it now. People are seeing firsthand the long-term effects. And I think Detroit and, the 3 bankruptcies in California certainly got people's attention, and they're seeing that for the ultimate nightmare it could end up, and it could go this way even still. Richard Riordan, the former mayor of Los Angeles, said that L.A. could go bankrupt in the next couple of years because of unaffordable pension costs. So we're not out of the woods, but there are proposals now being floated for the ballot in 2016 that would have at least move in the right direction of fixing this problem.
Lawrence, we're going to take a really, really short break. Stay on the line. We will be right back.
Rock